John and Rishi. So it looks like it's just a minute after 1, so it looks like we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Erica Mixon. I am the content marketing manager here at Blumira, responsible for writing blogs, running webinars like the one you're about to see, and any content marketing related activities. For 5 years, I was at TechTarget, where I was an editor covering B2B enterprise technology like Windows 10 management, VDI, and other topics like that. And I'm joined here by Brian Leskowski. Brian, do you want to give me a quick overview of your background?
Yeah, so currently here at Blumira, I work as one of the incident detection engineers. Prior to coming to Blumira, I worked as on the threat intel team for the state of Michigan, and I've done some previous work as a Linux system administrator as well. So it is near and dear to my heart to track things like we're going to discuss today with web shells. That's kind of how I got started in security when I was a Linux systems administrator. Had to spend a fair amount of time tracking down that kind of activity in our environment. And yeah, so excited to talk on the topic, and glad it's getting more attention than it did a few years ago.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like you have some great hands-on experience. So I'm sure our listeners here will get some really great insight into what to do to avoid a web shell attack, and we'll get right into it. Thanks for the intro. So first of all, let's talk quickly about what web shells are. They're not new, right? They've been around for a long time. So Brian, why now? Why are web shells becoming more important, and how have they changed over the past few years? It's kind of bringing them into the limelight a bit.
Sure. So, kind of to get started with the basis here is, what's the minimum requirements for a web shell? The key goal for any web shell is to allow someone to be able to interact with the underlying, server from the web. Sometimes this can be directly through, like, you open up the browser and you go to, http:/x.php, and, it presents you with a, giant menu and list of options like you see in the screenshot here. Or they can be a little more discreet too, where maybe it's just a file uploader, or it just passes commands from, the attacker's system to the underlying operating system. But one of the key components of that is that whatever it is, it has to be able to pass those commands. So we're talking about files or scripts that are written in common web server technologies like PHP, JSP, ASP, and ASPX. Mm-hmm. As far as the commonality, so this is kind of one of the axes I like to grind, is that why are we seeing them more? I think it's a little bit anecdotal here. I don't have direct stats, but a lot of security companies kind of haven't really paid much attention to a lot of web shells historically. It's still fairly common for when there's a major attack, for someone to find a web shell being used in it and upload it to VirusTotal, and out of the 60 something antivirus scanners, maybe one of them picks it up as a web shell, and the rest treat it as a legitimate file, or a harmless file. Certainly currently in the news, the Exchange Hafnium incident from earlier this year has brought a lot of recent spotlight, and obviously was the biggest information security news story before Colonial Pipeline. But obviously the news just keeps happening in the the cyberspace realm here. So I'm sure some people have even forgotten that was only like a month, 2 months ago, that that's all we were talking about was Exchange web shells.
Mm-hmm. So there's pretty detrimental effects to a web shell attack, as we can see with the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability. Are there any patterns that you see, like anything that makes a business susceptible to web shell attacks?
Mm-hmm. So there's certainly a lot of ways to establish a presence with the web shell, but there certainly are patterns that you see pretty commonly when it comes to finding a web shell. And probably the one that is the most common is out of date software being exposed on the internet. So, working at the web hosting provider as a Linux systems administrator, I was dealing with a lot of websites based around like WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla, content management systems. And certainly the most common, thing you saw was people not updating those websites. And over time, vulnerabilities get found, exploits get written. And, if they aren't patched, it allows, even an unskilled attacker to, take over a site like that. Going back to like, more of kind of like a headline dropping story, the breach of the credit system, that was what was that Experian? Equifax, sorry. Get those mixed up. But theirs was an unpatched Apache struts vulnerability that allowed the threat actors to establish a web shell that then they use to interact with the backend SQL databases and exfiltrate all of the credit records, that agency was holding. Right. So yeah, whether it be a small shop, with like a WordPress site to, a major credit reporting bureau, like you see that commonality of unpatched systems, or going back to the, recent news example of the exchange. That one, a little bit of a tweak because there was actually, a 0-day, but some people didn't patch, and there's still attacks going on against those, now known vulnerabilities, for those people who didn't patch, and you're still seeing web shells used for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So just some reminders for all you security folks out there, I would say is patch your servers and keep your software updated. If you don't take away anything from this webinar, maybe those are the two major takeaways. But we'll go a little bit more into some detection techniques for web shells specifically. So a few tools that companies will need to do this, and they're all, pretty standard and pretty low cost, right? A SIM like Blumira's can definitely be on the more affordable side. Can you tell me a little bit more, Brian, about these tools that people need and why they might need them?
Sure. Yeah. So again, when I got started, at detecting web shells, I didn't have a whole lot, at hand except for web server access logs and some scripts that I wrote. So it certainly doesn't take, an entire, security operations team to detect a web shell. But having technologies in place beforehand are certainly going to aid you in being able to detect those web shells quicker and react to them before they can really harm, your exposed systems. And, the other thing too, so I came from, the Linux realm where like web server access logs are just kind of expected. Recently, as we were working with Blumira to create detections for some of the Exchange stuff, I found out that that's not necessarily the case with Windows servers. You sometimes have to enable simple things like access logs. And if you don't have those turned on in the first place, that's going to make your life harder when it comes to, being able to detect or respond to a web shell. So yeah, at a baseline, making sure that your web server access logs are being recorded, is definitely number one. Again, if you're comfortable with scripting, there's some, scripts that you can write or some that you can, utilize that other people have written that can help you. Kind of going down the list here then, depending on your application, file integrity monitoring can be useful. I'll, going to the instance of, say like a WordPress site, usually you don't have files change a whole lot except when you're doing major updates to the application. So in that kind of an instance, watching for changes to files can certainly be a alerting methodology that you can look for. More often though, we're talking about kind of like once you've detected something, it helps you understand when it first showed up when we're talking with file integrity monitoring. And then yeah, a SIM. So some SIMs can be pretty expensive, but Blumira is kind of one of those products that's trying to break the mold on that. And the key thing there is that even if you have your, all your logs turned on that server, if the threat actor, has a web shell there, then they have access to modify things on the system. So theoretically, it doesn't happen all the time, but some actors will go and remove, modify, or otherwise, disable logging on that local system. So if you're not shipping your logs to another, centralized data source, it is possible that you can, lose that visibility that you would otherwise have.
Absolutely. I just launched a poll asking attendees if your access logs are centralized, and then if you're monitoring your web servers. Two really important things to have that a SIM can help with when it comes to web shell detection. And Brian, you talked to me earlier about a web shell that was detected in a previous job that you had that was around 6 to 7 years old. Can you tell me just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when we were kind of prepping for this, I was kind of thinking back to some of the different incident responses that I've had specific to web shells, and one of them that came to mind, is like, you think of about, what's the longest, it's, the term is dwell time, how long has a threat actor been in an environment with access to, do stuff on your system. And I think the longest one I saw was something that I worked on in like 2017, and the earliest presence, based on web shell activity that we could find was like back around 2010, 2011. So like, they were in the environment for a long time and no one, was even the wiser.
Yeah, that's crazy. And you were telling me that, the threat actors had a text file open where they were throwing different insults at each other saying, "This is my turf. Let me
That's
get
right. You." That's right. Yeah. If you have a, exposed and unpatched system, it's not necessarily just one threat actor that's going to get in there. So that was another funny, funny for us, not necessarily for the, person who owned that web server. But there was a text file where they were essentially, yelling at each other to say, "Get off my turf. I hacked this server first. And, well, I hacked it after you, and I removed your access. Haha."
Oh man, that's wild. So we actually have a question from Nawab. He's asking how a web shell is introduced into his web server in the first place. And that is exactly what we're going to answer in this next slide. So Brian, do you want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So in specific, this is kind of like that first stage, exactly, in relation to that question, is that, the first thing that has to happen, in a web shell attack is the threat actor has to get the shell on the system. As far as how it occurs, it can vary depending on how the threat actor gets in and what access they have. So if we're talking about vulnerabilities, that's going to be usually taking advantage, for the most part, it's going to be a public exploit, because again, majority of these web shell attacks are happening with known vulnerabilities. It's pretty, on the rare side when you're talking about, a 0-day like the Exchange one from earlier this year. So if you actually look on public databases like ExploitDB and search for a particular web technology like WordPress, again, is kind of the go-to example. It's like 20-30% of all websites on the web. So it's a commonly exploited, software. It's not hard to find exploits out there. And so those can vary. It depends on the software. But besides that, you can also have things like weak exposed remote admin access. So that could be something like RDP or SSH. The threat actors, will use that, or other backend software. So at the particular web host that I worked for, a lot of their servers had the cPanel hosting technology running on it as well. So if the threat actors brute force or otherwise gain, login credentials in that manner, they may use that access initially and then, use that access to then drop a web shell onto the system. Mm-hmm. So it can vary from that initial access, but again, kind of like the key thing is making sure you keep things patched. Second to that, I would say it would be those remote access things. So make sure you're using 2FA, or if you can keep the remote admin tools internal or behind a VPN, those are going to be kind of some of those key controls that you can use to limit that exposure.
Right.
But as far as then from a detection standpoint, what you're going to be looking for is some of the stuff we're calling out, on screen here. So to interact with the underlying, server and issue commands, you're generally going to be looking for files like PHP, ASP, ASPX, and JSP. So like a text file or an HTML file, a threat actor can't use that to issue a command to the underlying operating system, but with PHP, they certainly can. So in this case, we're looking at one of the Blumira detections, which relies upon sysmon on a Windows server, where it can look for the server process itself, writing new files of those types into web server directories. So in terms of, that's a good early sign to let you know that a web shell is being used in an attack against you.
Yeah, absolutely. And these files, the PHP, ASP files, once those are created, generally they're created once and then they just stay there, right? Like you're not generally seeing new files like these pop up from time to time.
Correct. Yeah. So again, using WordPress as again the go-to example here. So there's tons of PHP files in a WordPress install, but as you pointed out there, once that install is done, you're usually not seeing new PHP files get created except upon major software revisions or updates. Mm-hmm. So, seeing a new PHP file show up outside of a maintenance window, that should be something, that is a very rare occurrence and should be something that you investigate.
Got it. We actually have another question from Nawab. He's asking, if an intruder has already gained access by exploiting an existing vulnerability, why would they need to drop a web shell then? Is it only to maintain persistence access?
So usually that exploit only allows them to do one or two things. So, a common example of when an attacker is going to drop a web shell is, let's say the exploit that they are using allows them to upload arbitrary files. That allows them to upload an arbitrary file, but it doesn't allow them to issue commands to the server. So they need something to then broker more access because that exploit only allows them to upload a file, right? So the web shell becomes the next phase when they want to do more than just upload a file.
Okay, and that's actually a nice segue into our next slide, which talks about web shell usage. Can you tell me a little bit about this phase in the web shell attack stage?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So on screen here, you're seeing a Windows ASPX web shell that we were using during some of our testing, and how in this case it's a little bit blurry there, but essentially on the screen there in the browser, I'm issuing a PowerShell command through that web shell. So again, under the, if the threat actor's exploit only allows them to upload a file, how do they then, do the next thing? So by uploading this web shell, now I can issue any arbitrary PowerShell command that I want, which gives you a lot of, things that you can do, anything that a Windows systems administrator can do, right? And so in this case, this one's specific to how it operates on a Windows system. IIS, the web server that you generally run on a Windows system, it runs with processes that are known as w3wp.exe, and you'll generally have a few of them running on a system. But in Windows, you generally should see, w3wp just kind of, spawns other web server processes. So in this case, what we can look for then is when W3 or WP tries to issue a new child process to command or to PowerShell, something that you generally should not be seeing your web server doing. And if you are seeing it, again, that's one of those key triggers to let you know, hey, something abnormal is happening here, we should investigate.
Right. And this is something that you can detect with Blumira as well if you've deployed Sysmon, which is a free tool. So that's kind of a no-brainer to deploy Sysmon in your opinion, right, Brian?
For sure, for sure. So Windows by default, doesn't do a whole lot of process monitoring. There are some process monitoring that you can turn on just built into Windows, but Sysmon, which is part of the sysinternal tool suite by Mark Rusanovich, expands on it to an extent that allows you to track so much more that's happening on the system and really be able to zero in on, things that are illegitimate, in terms of what's occurring on the system that you can't see with just the built-in login capabilities.
Right.
But the fact that it's free is amazing. It really does offer a lot for the price of nothing.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to go back to the poll real quick. It looks like we have some answers here. Looks like 50% of our attendees don't know whether their access logs are centralized. And also 50% don't know if they're monitoring, or I'm sorry, 25% don't know if they're monitoring their web servers, and 50% aren't monitoring their web servers. So feel free to reach out to us at Blumira. We can definitely help you out with both of those things and can kind of give you some insight on how you can improve your security capabilities there.
Right. Definitely in a lot of, smaller shops, when you think of, preparing a security program, a lot of times you're thinking about, user endpoints, right? And servers can sometimes get forgotten. So going back to the whole, why are we seeing more? Well, it's because more people are starting to think about monitoring these things, both, from a security company perspective, but also from, a security owner perspective, right? So like things like the Exchange vulnerability make people, stand up and pay attention, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So moving on to the next slide, we're talking about web shell interaction. So what would be some signs that a web shell is interacting with your environment?
Sure. So in this case, we're taking a step back and say, for whatever instance, you can't see the exact process, or let's say we're looking at a Linux system instead of a Windows-based system without, the capability to look at sysmon. Well, there are some other kind of tells that most web shells exhibit. So when you're talking about a web application, most of the time, if I'm going to visit, google.com or whatever, like I am requesting information from that website, and then it gets, sent to me with something called a GET request. Web shells, on the other hand, need to send information from the client and push it to the server. And so most of the time, that's going to be post traffic. So one of the common techniques then to hunt for web shell usage is looking for a high frequency or number of post requests to the same resource on a server. So like, and this assumes that you've gone through and excluded things that will do that. So like, for instance, going back to our WordPress example, let's say you're running a site with a lot of members that log in. Well, you're going to see a lot of post requests as people go to wp-login.php because they have to send their credentials to the server, right? Mm-hmm. But if, sitting on the server, in the same folder as, wp-login.php is also x.php, and all of a sudden you see a single IP sending hundreds or thousands of post requests to x.php, that's one of those things that can easily and quickly identify that someone, is interacting with a web shell on your system. Mm-hmm. Because that will stand out like a sore thumb. And, by things, obviously we were looking at the abnormalities in terms of the post traffic from a single IP, but also you as the administrator should be able to think, did I put a file called x.php on my system? And the answer is probably going to be no, because usually, the stuff that's on there, it follows a much more normal naming scheme, all right?
Right. So patterns to look out for, just to summarize, would be strangely named files, web shells sending specific requests to a server, so GET requests, and then post traffic. So if that post traffic is not to like a login portal or contact us or an ordering page, that's probably a red flag to look out for.
Correct. Yeah, you can see in our alert on screen here that for this test, I was using the WSO.php web shell, which is actually a commonly available web shell of Russian origin. In my testing here, that exact thing. So we identified, using Blumira that, there was a ton of post requests going to this particular file path on our server, and that's what we used to then trigger that alert.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And are there any, we're talking about the patterns here, are there any threat actors that avoid these patterns somehow and just are maybe a little bit more sophisticated?
Certainly, it is possible. There's always you call it, defense evasion techniques out there. And it is certainly possible to change your patterns, which is why you need to, layer these, types of things. So the more ways that you can detect something, the better off you're going to be able to pick up on that evasion. So maybe if they aren't using post requests, they're using a lot of put requests instead. That's why you would want to have those other detections in place to help catch, even if they are able to avoid, this particular detection. But for the most part, most of the threat actors they don't need to use that because, web shells are already poorly detected enough as is. So a lot of the attackers really aren't even bothering with that at this point.
Right.
So still pretty effective detection wise.
Yeah, absolutely. And these detections that we've been mentioning throughout the presentation here, the thing that is great about Blumira is that our detections are prioritized. So you're not getting a ton of alerts like other SIMs that are a little bit more noisy where, maybe you're getting so many alerts to the point where you have to ignore those alerts and then miss really high priority security incidents. So Blumira offers a SIM that's has prioritized alerts where, when you get an alert, that it's important and that you have to look into it. And then also we have those remediation steps with our security experts where, we're telling you some options of what to do, which is great for small security teams. And then we'll just go into here a little bit about how Blumira can help specifically with web shell detection. Can you talk to that a little bit, Brian? We kind of already spoke to this a little bit, but.
So yeah, going through, coming back to it is, you're looking at that layer defense there and trying to detect more than just a single, technique or a single point in that interaction there. But then in terms of, sending it to a SIM. So, kind of coming back to that, increasing your capabilities. So again, you can do this without, a SIM, but it does take a lot more hands-on keyboard and, interactive time. Whereas having it centralized in the SIM can allow you to get those actionable alerts when needed, as opposed to have to spend a lot of man hours, writing a script yourself or doing manual, investigations yourself. But in terms of, coming back to, why or what Blumira specifically can help with in terms of, being able to action on the SIM is really that not needing to have an entire team manage a SIM for you. So my last, employment at the state, we had like an 8-person team to keep our SIM from falling over.
Right.
It was one of the old legacy SIMs that, required large deployments, lots of, team to maintain and support, as opposed to Blumira with its, cloud first, strategy. You don't have to feed and maintain it. Like that is all handled for you. You just need to worry about when you get, an alert. And then when you get an alert, you have that advice and that assistance from Blumira to be able to walk you through it. Because yeah, a lot of people haven't seen these types of attacks before. So, that's a part of that, what we try and bring to the table there is, to give you a workflow to be able to, action through that incident for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that we're cloud first. And one of the things that I'm really excited about recently is that we launched a new integration with AWS recently. So that's a huge win for our customers that have deployed AWS. And, AWS is such a popular cloud service, and we have detections that are related to CloudTrail and GuardDuty and all of the major cloud monitoring tools that you'll get in AWS. And our next webinar is actually next Thursday, May 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll be talking about tackling cloud security threats in AWS. That'll be with Jim Simpson, who's the VP of Product, and then Patrick Garrity, who's the VP of Ops at Blumira. So they'll go into more specifically how that AWS integration will be able to help. So excited about that one for sure. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Brian. Hopefully you all got some really helpful advice. I know that I learned a lot about detecting web shells. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you to all the attendees for joining as well, and for asking some really thoughtful questions and joining us here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.